This is the third in our video series. If you haven't watched the first two, I would highly urge you to watch them. Otherwise, this video is going to make a lot less sense. In this video, I'm going to dive into the process of analyzing meaning or extracting meaning from MotivBase Trends using the topic universe, using our solar system of topics that the machine presents us with. I'm also going to talk about where the data comes from and how we source the data and organize the data internally. And I'm going to link that back to the underlying framework of structural anthropology, which we began and talked about in the very first video. So fundamentally, when you run a search, instantly the machine is organizing the broader context of language, the broader context of words and topics that consumers associate with gut health. It is quantifying it and surfacing the most dominant ones and putting them before us. Now, how does it know what's more dominant, what's less dominant? It's very simple. If you take the broader context of discussions around gut health, extract topics from it, and then quantify frequency, volume, and semantic relationship, you will start to get a structure where you can actually measure the distance from the sun to all these planets. So that's fundamentally what we're doing. We're measuring the semantic relationship based on the frequency and nature of relationship of these topics over time within the broader context of the underlying search term. So once we have that and we can surface all these topics, then the process of analysis truly begins. And in that process of analysis, what our system allows us to do, allows our researchers and you as a user to do, is explore each of these topics. So for example, in the context of gut health, if you see dietary changes showing up, it's our prerogative to then click into that, look at the other related connections. This is basically one layer down. So this is other topics related to gut health and dietary changes. We can now explore these further connections, these topics, explore the articles that consumers themselves are sharing among one another in the context of dietary changes and gut health, and make some quick interpretations. Now, as you go through this exercise, you'll find that it's actually fairly logical, fairly easy to make some of these interpretations. For example, now that you know that dietary changes is closely related to gut health, it's really a question of trying to figure out why that might be related. And in this case, clearly you can see food sensitivities, for example, or leaky gut. So clearly food triggers. So clearly there's a triggering feeling that people are experiencing. There's sensitivities, there's whatever is going on in their tummies and their guts that is causing them to consider a change in diet. And it's also causing them to care about gut health. So that's an obvious logical conclusion I've drawn here from just 2 minutes of exploration. Now there's so much more you can do, because you can actually take this, and let's say this is of keen interest to your business for whatever reason, you can hit this down arrow button, add it as what we call a microculture, and now you're telling the machine, hey, go zoom in on this particular planet of dietary changes and show me the system of moons around this planet and all the other related planets that are very close to this particular planet. So now we're kind of taking the microscope into dietary changes, getting a new topic universe, and now analyzing that and knowing that all of this is still very much in the broader context of gut health. So now we're basically zooming into dietary changes to try and build a narrative for ourselves of what that might mean. So here you can see that, there's a bunch of things going on here in the context of dietary changes. We had already learned that there was something happening in terms of triggers, maybe it's gut issues, leaky gut, things like that. We saw there's some sensitivity related trigger that was causing an interest in dietary changes. Now we can see that there's also a whole host of topics here that revolve around nutrition. So clearly nutrition is also, and in fact nutritional deficiency is also related to this. So clearly we can see that people are also obviously concerned about being nutritionally deficient and likely associating that with some of the gut-related triggers, negative triggers that they're experiencing in their diets or in their bodies. So all of this is basically a way for us to dive deeper and deeper into the narrative, and slowly, as we spend more and more time exploring each of these topics, we can start to build ourselves a cluster that we might now call dietary changes, and add all the notes and observations that we're making by exploring these topics, and building a cluster and narrative for ourselves. So in essence, we're doing an ethnographic exploration here using these topics. Of course, I'm doing this very quickly live for you, but if you spend 30-40 minutes, you'll end up with a series of clusters with a lot of rich detail and a detailed understanding of not just what they mean in the context of gut health, but also of the quantification of them as well. So for example, here you can see that turns out the microculture of dietary changes in the macroculture of gut health is actually more mature and larger in size than the culture of gut health by itself. So clearly, when you start to focus on dietary changes, it expands your gut health culture beyond the original boundary that gut health itself was establishing. So there's so much potential in what the technology does, but all of this is enabled because our technology is going and grabbing the broader context of discussions, extracting the topics, and then quantifying them and surfacing the most dominant topics that then serve as breadcrumbs for us to then double click into and explore. So let's address the important question that's probably in your mind. Where does the data come from? Well, it's actually quite simple. The data comes from places like forums, blogs, news sites, comment sections under YouTube videos themselves, we transcribe them, and other such data sources. The data does not come from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Why? Very simple reasons. First, for the purpose of anthropology, we need to extract data from places where people can actually engage in discourse, use words to talk to one another. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, these are all platforms where there's a lot of hearting and liking and sharing, and not as much true engagement, not as much use of words and language in order to talk to one another and give meaning to things. That's pretty much why those platforms are of less value to us for this purpose. Secondly, we need some form of anonymity. When people hide behind a pseudonym, a moniker, on a forum, for example, they are so much braver in their ability to share their values, their belief systems. They're so much more open to talking about the things that truly bother them, that are going on in their lives. They're more open to being vulnerable. All the things they cannot do on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And for that reason, we scrape all these other sources. Now, there's some added benefits to that. It's all the public web. We don't store the verbatims. We store the extracted topics and relationships, which means we are also GDPR compliant. And the added benefit also is that, in fact, in a lot of these forums and such places, there's so much richness of data that not only do we get a fully representative sample of the population of a country like the US or the UK or France, but we also get so much discourse on the margins. So for example, communities, cultures, groups that feel marginalized in society always have incredible communities online, and always have, in particular, incredible communities on places like forums. So they end up being one of the richest sources. And because of that, and because we scrape with a randomness algorithm and pretty much scrape anything and everything that people talk about, it allows you, when you're using our technology, to pretty much search for anything and everything. And it also gives you the freedom to add whatever kind of context to any search. For example, to gut health, I can add the context of social justice, and now I'm studying how people think about gut health and social justice together in context. So now you might learn about things like fat phobia, things like how nutrition science is not fully sort of open to communities of color, to different communities and groups of ways of eating and diet and so on and so forth. So it's very powerful as a tool, not just for exploration, but for deep diving, to study the structure of language, and in particular, study meaning and get to that implicit, that 70% implicit side of the equation, so that not only do you understand what is truly happening in a culture, but you can make bets knowing what is going to happen. And these bets are based on the calculations where we examine meaning, not what is going on in the marketplace. So you get to go beyond the shiny object syndrome that happens in the marketplace and actually look at these predictions through the lens of meaning, which means they're so much more accurate, they're so much more reliable, and you can make better bets for the longevity of your business. And we'll talk more about this in the next video. Thanks for watching.